Sup, Bruskevki. Today we're going to be solving a problem I have. Despite my Necron army having a sick-ass paint scheme, the unfinished bases make the whole thing look like crap, and I think it's about time I fix that. I've decided that I want a ruined tiles and desert-themed base design. I've also decided that I want to try making molds and casting my bases so I can really push the details. I don't have any experience with mold making, but if I manage to pull it off, I'm hoping it'll step up the quality of the army and allow me to create a lot of bases really quickly. I decided that I wanted to start with 10 32mm bases and 6 40mm bases. I feel like that will give me a good start to getting a large portion of my army done. Now I'm sure you're wondering how I picked the design for my tiles. Through trial and error, mostly. I got all these old wooden pattern blocks from when I was a kid and used them to experiment with some designs for the tiles. I went through a couple of different designs before getting one that I liked. I eventually decided that I wanted something hex-based because hexes are the best shape. After some experimentation, I decided that I like this shape made up of 3 hexagons, which I should be able to tile without any problems. I took the design into FreeCAD to make the texture roller. I started by making the basic shape out of hexagons and turning the internal lines into sketch geometry. I then added a bunch of copies as sketches so I could figure out the spacing of the tiles. I used the Lattice 2 workbench to tile the hex shape. I then applied the sketch to the outside of a cylinder using the Curves workbench. After I had my extrusion, I did a Boolean subtract on a second cylinder using the Parts workbench. After I had the finished model, I ran off a copy on my 3D printer. The 3D print did end up warping whilst curing, but it does still roll fine, so it should work okay. I decided to make my tiles out of a mix of Milliput and green stuff, a combination that is sometimes called Milleen stuff by me and no one else. I have some experience working with green stuff, but this is my first time trying Milliput. If you've never used Milliput or green stuff before, the two are both 2-part epoxy putties where you knead them together and then they will cure into a permanent material. My final green stuff mix ended up lumpy. At first I thought this was because my green stuff is old, but it's actually because I was using the ribbon style of green stuff, where the 2 parts are touching and cure in the middle. You'll be able to get a better look at that later on. After I got the Milliput thoroughly mixed, I combined it with the green stuff to make the Milleen stuff. From what I understand, Milleen stuff is an almost ideal combination of the 2 materials. Milliput is more clay-like and green stuff is more rubbery, and by combining the two, you get a good median with the benefits of both materials. I'm mostly interested in how it'll cure since green stuff tends to be a little flexible, and I'm hoping for something a little harder than that. Once I got the 2 mixed together, I rolled it out. I sandwiched the Milleen stuff between 2 pieces of parchment paper to keep it from sticking. Then I rolled it out using an empty vodka bottle because I don't own a rolling pin. Once I had a flat disc, I went over it with my texture roller that I had lubricated with a little olive oil. The roller worked well, giving me the clean lines that I wanted. After using the rollers, I went over it with a ball of aluminum foil to add some extra texture to the tiles. This is where things started to go wrong for me. I'd 3D printed some punches to try and cut blanks the same size as the bases. The Milleen stuff didn't cut very well and ended up sticking to the punches. The parts ended up deforming trying to remove them from the cutters and weren't very good. I also tried making the tiles directly on the base, which did work better than the punches, but still wasn't the best to work with. Here you can see the results of my first test. The tiles are way too thick and the marks left by the foil are sharper than I would like. I also have some doubling from trying to go over the tiles more than once with the texture roller. The Milleen stuff does cut easily with a knife and can be sanded, which means I can still work it after curing without any trouble. The epoxy did stick very well to the base even without glue. After cutting this sample in half, you can see the uncured sections that I was talking about earlier. Attempt number 2, I made sure to remove the middle section of my green stuff before thoroughly mixing. I've also 3D printed some spacers to try and get the Meline stuff rolled out to a consistent thickness. And I've also bought a rolling pin, which is easier to use than the vodka bottle. This time I tried using a small rock to add the additional texture instead of the foil, which I think worked out much better, leaving much softer details instead of the overly sharp that I was getting from the foil. After getting the texture added, I tried cutting the blanks to the rough size of the bases and planned to refine them later. This did work, but I don't think it's the easiest way to do this. After my blanks cured, I decided to try completing a couple of bases to make sure my plans were going to work out. I trimmed down my blanks using some cutters and glued them down to the bases. I then added some extra details using some 3D prints. A while ago, there was a project to create 3D scans from a bunch of different artifacts and statues. Most of the 3D prints I'm using here are from that project, since I thought it would be cool to have some real bones and artifacts as a part of my bases. I did end up editing some of the scans, trying to make them look a little less human, a little less identifiable, and a little bit more alien. I also added a couple of pieces of aquarium gravel to help fill out space and add a little bit more texture variance. Once the glue dried, I cut down the extra Meline stuff from the edges and then sanded them to be flush with the bases. I tried a few different methods to trim them, but my hobby cutters ended up being the best. After getting the tiles smoothed, I started gluing down these small filler stones I got from the dollar store. They're way too big to be sand at this scale, but I'm using them mostly as filler to get the sand to the same height of the tiles. I'll also be adding just a little bit of variation in the particle size of the sand. I'm also using them to fill in any gaps around the 3D printed parts because I'm trying to avoid any undercuts for when I make molds of these later. After that's had time to dry, I went back and added a layer of construction sand that I ran through a mesh to get just the smallest grains. I was pretty happy with how my test bases turned out, so I was able to move forward with my final attempt using everything I'd learned so far. I started by mixing up my Meline stuff, rolling it out, and using my new texture roller, which is the same as the old one but with a smaller diameter. I then added extra texture with a stone and left the sheet to cure. After curing, I took my sheet of tiles and cut them into small sections using my hobby cutters and glued them down to the bases. From here, I followed my steps from before with the addition of using Tamiya putty at the end to fill in any gaps between the tiles and the bases. After the putty is cured, I sand it down smooth. With that, I have the final versions of my bases. I'm very happy with how they've turned out. I think they look great with my Necrons. I did prime all of them, partially so you can see the details on camera, and partially because I'm using resin printed parts, which can cause issues when making silicone molds. I took my finished bases and made a quick mold box out of cardboard and hot glue. I know the sides are way taller than I'm going to be needing, but I'm not planning on filling the box all the way up to the top with silicone. Once I had that finished, I mixed up a small batch of silicone. I wanted to check that I'm not going to have any curing issues, so I put a small dab on one of my bases and used the rest around the edges. Doing this, I can check for any curing inhibition with the hot glue and any of the materials I used to make my bases. Everything did cure, so I was confident to move forward with the final mold. I did end up remaking the mold box since I was unhappy with the first one. I was hoping I could get something a little smaller and hopefully save on silicone. So I mixed up a batch of silicone and poured it into my molds. Unfortunately, I did have some issues with my camera and wasn't able to film most of it, but the technique is pretty simple. Mix the silicone following the directions on the box, pour it in a thin stream from high up to pop most of the bubbles, and make sure not to drape the part in silicone so you don't trap any bubbles at the surface. Now, I don't have a vacuum chamber or a pressure pot, so I've got a lot of bubbles, but the cure time for this silicone is 5 to 7 hours, and I found it took even longer than that in my testing, so I'm hoping most of them will work themselves out, which is what ended up happening. Truthfully, I'm not super concerned with most of the bubbles. Since I don't have a pressure pot, the only bubbles that will be a problem are the ones that are at the surface of the base. Removing the molds from the mold boxes went super smoothly. Some of the paint did stick to the inside of the molds, which isn't a problem since it should all come out with the first resin pour. For my first pour, I mixed up 2 ounces of resin, which ended up being a little bit more than the little cups I was using could handle, and I made a bit of a mess. The small cups ended up being a blessing in disguise, since this mold only holds about 2 ounces. The resin I used cures in about 10 minutes, so I had to work really quickly, mixing until the cup started to get warm, which only took about 90 seconds before pouring. I'm thrilled with the end results. I did have some trouble with catching a few bubbles while pouring the resin, but one of the advantages of doing a ruin scheme is that any errors I have in the casting can easily be sold off as additional weathering. Now all I have to do is give them a quick paint job and glue the models to the bases. I'm still not sure if this is going to be my final color scheme or not. After a base layer, a wash, and a quick dry brush, I picked out the bones and artifacts with some extra detail, and then I was ready to glue my models to the bases. Yes, I do know you're not supposed to glue the model directly to the paint because it results in a bond that is only as strong as the paint is, but I'm doing it anyway. These are Necron models, which are notorious for having small limbs that break off easily, and if I drop my models, I would prefer that they pop off of the bases than for their ankles to break off. And with that, my Necrons are finally finished. Overall, I'm very happy with how they've turned out, but I'm not sure if that's just the IKEA effect at work. I'd love to hear what you all think and welcome any tips for improving my process. If you're interested in trying to make these bases yourself, I do have the SDL for the texture roller available for sale on Colds 3D. If you don't want to buy it, feel free to make your own. I have shown the measurements that I used for it. In my next video, I'm going to be scratch building a couple of Necron monoliths. So if that's the kind of thing that interests you, go ahead and hit the subscribe button so you don't miss it. In the meantime, remember, everyone has their own hobby journey, and I'd like to thank you for joining me on mine.